Okay, so we're almost done, but I want to talk for just a little while at the end here about the title question of Malcolm X's piece. He titles the speech, "The Ballot or the Bullet." So I think we need to ask what question he's asking and what his answer is. Right? On the face of it, I think the question is, do we bring about change by trying to work within the system and vote for leaders who will uphold our values and bring about the changes we want them to bring about? Or do we bring about change through, and then it's hard, there's an interesting question about what the bullet here means, right? But something like violent, disruptive attacks on the system. The title of the speech seems to indicate that he's advocating one or the other. You pick the ballot or you pick the bullet. I don't think that's quite right. I think he thinks that we need both. We need the ballot and the bullet. He points out, and again, this is another moment where these speeches seem amazingly current. This is still true. He points out rightly that white Americans are extremely narrowly divided when it comes to party-based electoral politics. And almost all of our national elections are decided by tiny margins, right? There's a huge number of people who are going to vote Democrat no matter what, white people, and a huge number of white people who are going to vote Republican no matter what. And those are almost equally sized piles of people. And then there's this tiny little group of people in the middle who can be swayed, and they're the ones who tend to decide elections. And his point is, if all the black people got together and organized and showed up to vote and decided who they were supporting, and of course it doesn't have to be all, but like a large number of black people got organized, decided who they were supporting, and showed up to vote, black people could control the outcome of the election. And I think that's just kind of objectively true, right? If we did manage to get black people in this country voting at a very high rate, that would settle whether we elected a Democrat or a Republican, because the difference between the two is never more than a few percentage points. So in that sense, he thinks that black people should really feel empowered to use the ballot and should use it more than they do. But he also argues at the same time that there isn't as much difference between the parties as one might think. It's an interesting question whether this is still currently true. But at least in the 60s when he was talking, he wants to argue that both parties are ultimately still tools of white institutions and institutions that are structured by white privilege. That much I think he's certainly still right about. Right? In other words, both parties are tools of institutions and policies that reinscribe all those things we looked at with Iris Young, that reinscribe cultural imperialism, that reinscribe exploitation, that reinscribe things like the prison system and the police system that exercise systemic violence on black communities. And so ultimately, the differences from the black point of view, he believes, are pretty surface level. Like, yes, one party might have better policies than the other, but ultimately neither of them is disrupting the basic structure of white domination. And furthermore, neither party has black interests at heart because, as we've seen, ultimately power protects its own interests. And so he thinks electoral politics on their own are never going to radically change institutions. It would be interesting to know what he thinks now that we have, in fact, had an African American president, right, who came and went and who didn't, in fact, radically change institutions that uphold white privilege. I mean, I don't think that would be a huge surprise to him because he never talks as though changing the basic structure of society is going to come down to one individual like that. So even if we manage to elect a black president, that doesn't mean that we have done something that is going to fundamentally change the deep structure of white institutions in this country. However, it would be interesting to hear his post-Obama commentary on electoral politics. In any case, the point is that on the one hand, if Black people really got out the vote and voted as a bloc, they could control the outcome of elections. But the other point is that if all they're doing is controlling whether we elect a Democrat or elect a Republican, they're picking between two parties that are deeply bound up with and complicit with institutions of white privilege, and so that on its own is not going to make a difference. So the ballot on its own is not enough, right? We need a new option, and that requires revolution, not just picking between the options that are already available. And that means that we need not only the ballot, but the bullet. Now, I think he's chosen his words very carefully here, because if you listen to the speech, as I said in the last lecture, nothing that he says involves calling for actual violence. He's very careful not to do that. He says we could be violent. He says we could be violent. He says it's not obviously unjustified to ever be violent. He says that the threat of violence is a powerful tool, but nowhere in that speech does he say, go be violent. So if he's calling for the bullet, I don't think we should take him as literally calling for shooting. Right? What he mostly means, I believe, is that we need not just electing among options that exist, that's the ballot, but also killing the old system, right? Genuinely disrupting it. Martin Luther King also wanted to disrupt it, but he doesn't think that Martin Luther King's disruptive methods are disruptive enough. He wants to mess up the old system, pull it apart, not just revise it and not just get access to it and not just tweak it by picking a party that will do a slightly better version of it. So the bullet here is really a metaphorical bullet that is aimed at a system. Just plunge in and destroy it is what he wants to say. But of course, it's no accident whatsoever that he likes that particular metaphor, right? The metaphor of the bullet is not accidental. It does contain an implicit threat of violence, for sure. And in particular, he's playing off of and subverting, again, a stereotype of Black men as particularly prone to gun violence, right? So he's using that stereotype that has been wielded as a weapon of control against Black men and claiming it and saying, you associate us with this particular form of violence, I'm going to evoke that particular form of violence as my metaphor here. But I do think that, so on the one hand, I'm not trying to shy away from the fact that he is making room for violence and he's making very definite room for the threat of violence. But on the other hand, I think it's important to see the way that the bullet is functioning metaphorically here as meaning wreck the system, don't just play within the system and use the electoral system as it's handed to us and tweak and choose from within it, actually destroy it. And it's an interesting question, the extent to which Martin Luther King would agree with him on that, right? Of course, Martin Luther King would not like the metaphor of the bullet, but remember, King also argues that the laws are not just broken or misused, they are fundamentally unjust. They need to be actually changed. So he's not going to use as violent of a metaphor, but I think he too believes that electoral politics is never going to do it for us, because as long as we're just choosing representatives of institutions that are already in place, it's not going to bring about the kind of fundamental change that would be necessary to end racist oppression. And Angela Davis agrees as well, clearly. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'm just going to remind you that we've gone through a whole lot of ideas here, including the idea of Black nationalism, which Malcolm X subscribes to, Martin Luther King less clearly so. Segregation versus integration, right? And X's argument for segregation as a strategy. This issue of civil disobedience and this issue of the place of violence and the, I think, separate issue of the place of the threat of violence. These are all distinct issues, so there's really a lot that was packed into these lectures. And I realize this was pretty dense, and there's always barriers to doing this online where I can't look at your faces and tell which parts you're getting and which parts are confusing you and which parts you agree with and which parts are troubling you. So it's always a real barrier doing it this way, but I hope that that made sense for you and worked. And you can talk about it more in your discussion sections, of course. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.